My husband said I was too clingy and needed my own life, so I got one. When David complained I had no friends, no hobbies, nothing but him, I thought he was being cruel. We'd been married 8 years. I'd moved across the country for his job, left my career, my family, everything. Of course, he was my whole world. You suffocate me, he'd say after I'd suggest we grab dinner together. You need to find yourself outside of this marriage. I can't be your entire universe. It's not healthy. The way he said healthy made it sound clinical. Like I was a patient with a diagnosis that required treatment. Fine. I'd show him independent. I started small. Yoga classes on Tuesdays where I pretended to understand chakras and breathed through poses that made my muscles scream. The instructor, a willowy woman named Moonbeam who smelled like patchouli and spoke in whispers, would adjust my warrior pose while talking about opening my heart chakra. I'd nod seriously while thinking about grocery lists. Book club on Thursdays where I speed read novels about suburban women finding themselves through affairs or pottery. We met at the library in a circle of mismatched chairs, discussing character motivations over store-bought cookies. The other women were nice enough, but our conversations felt scripted, like we were all performing the role of fulfilled suburban wife. A ceramics workshop that left clay under my fingernails for days, evidence of my new artistic pursuits. The teacher was an elderly man who'd been making bowls for 40 years and had strong opinions about glaze temperatures. My first attempts looked like ashtrays made by a drunk toddler, but I persevered, mostly because David seemed impressed by my dedication to creative growth. David seemed genuinely pleased when I'd come home chattering about new people and experiences. He'd nod approvingly as I described my classmates, ask thoughtful questions about my projects. Look at you, he'd say with satisfaction, like I was a home improvement project showing promising results. This is exactly what you needed. For the first time in years, he looked at me with something approaching pride. Then I joined a hiking group that met Saturday mornings. That's where I met Ryan. The group was an eclectic mix of retirees, young professionals, and people like me who were trying to fill time they'd never had before. Ryan stood out immediately, not because he was particularly handsome, though he was, but because of how he moved through the world. Confident without being arrogant, present in a way that made you feel like the conversation you were having was the only thing that mattered. Ryan was everything David wasn't. Where David was methodical and controlled, measuring coffee with precision and folding his shirts into perfect squares, Ryan was spontaneous. Where David criticized my tendency to leave dishes in the sink or forget to replace the toilet paper, Ryan encouraged. When I mentioned I'd always wanted to learn photography, but David had called it an expensive hobby with no practical application, Ryan showed up the next week with a borrowed camera and infectious enthusiasm. The first time he handed me that camera, something clicked. Not just the shutter, though I took dozens of terrible photos that first day, but something deeper. I'd forgotten what it felt like to want something just for the joy of wanting it. We started meeting for coffee after hikes, then lunch at small cafes where Ryan would point out interesting light patterns and architectural details I'd never noticed. He had this way of seeing beauty in ordinary things that made me feel like I'd been walking through the world half blind. Then evening photography walks through downtown, where he taught me about composition and timing while the city transformed around us. He was patient with my questions, never condescending when I struggled with manual settings or couldn't understand why one shot worked better than another. I told David I was taking photography classes, meeting friends, exploring my independence like he'd suggested. All technically true, though I left out the part about how my instructor made me laugh until my sides hurt, or how he looked at me like I was fascinating instead of disappointing. The first time Ryan kissed me was during golden hour at the botanical gardens. I was adjusting my camera settings, frustrated because the light kept changing faster than I could compensate, when he gently turned my face toward his. The kiss was soft, tentative, nothing like David's efficient peck's goodbye. It felt like waking up from a very long sleep. I should have felt guilty. The old me, the me who'd followed David across the country without question, would have been consumed with shame. Instead, I felt alive for the first time in years. Colors seemed brighter, food tasted better, even the air felt different in my lungs. For 3 months, I lived this impossible double life. David at home, discussing mortgage refinancing and the neighbor's property values, and whether we needed to reseal the driveway before winter. Ryan in stolen moments, making me laugh until my stomach hurt, teaching me to see beauty in abandoned buildings and storm clouds, and the way light fell across my face when I wasn't paying attention. The contrast was jarring. With David, every conversation felt like a meeting, efficient and purpose-driven. With Ryan, we could spend hours talking about nothing and everything, losing track of time in ways that felt both reckless and necessary. David noticed the change immediately. I was happier, more confident, less likely to apologize for taking up space or having opinions that differed from his. He took full credit for pushing me toward independence, proud of his psychological insight. "Look how much better you are when you have your own thing," he'd say, gesturing at my improved posture and actual opinions about dinner plans. "I knew you just needed structure and goals outside of us." If only he knew what my real goals had become. The unraveling started when David decided to surprise me at book club. He showed up at the library with flowers, ready to take his newly independent wife to dinner at the Italian place we'd been going to for anniversaries. Except I wasn't there, because there was no Thursday book club anymore. There hadn't been for 2 months, not since I'd started spending Thursday evenings in Ryan's apartment, learning about aperture settings and depth of field while he cooked elaborate meals and told stories about his travels through Southeast Asia. The librarian who knew our group told David we'd canceled weeks ago due to scheduling conflicts. She suggested he try my cell phone. When I came home from my evening with Ryan, David was sitting in the dark kitchen, the flowers wilted on the counter like a funeral arrangement. "Where were you?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying that dangerous calm I'd learned to recognize over 8 years of marriage. My heart hammered against my ribs. Photography class ran late. New assignment on night photography, very technical stuff. He nodded slowly, but something fundamental had shifted in his eyes. The trust that had been there for 8 years, even during our worst fights about money and in-laws and whose turn it was to clean the bathroom, was gone. "Show me what you worked on tonight," he said, his tone still conversational. I fumbled with my camera, showing him blurry shots I'd taken hastily in Ryan's neighborhood on my way home. David studied them with the same intensity he brought to quarterly reports, his analytical mind cataloging every detail. "These are terrible," he observed matter-of-factly. "I'm still learning," I said weakly. "For how long now? 6 months?" The question was a trap. I'd been claiming photography classes for 6 months, but these photos looked like someone had just picked up a camera for the first time. "The instructor focuses more on theory than practice," I lied, the words tasting like copper in my mouth. The next week, he called during my supposed yoga class. I was actually at Ryan's apartment, laughing at his terrible attempts to make pad thai while he told me about the photography exhibition he wanted to submit my work to. The phone rang just as Ryan was demonstrating his complete lack of chopstick skills, noodles falling everywhere. "How's class?" David asked when I answered, slightly breathless from laughter. "Good. We're working on balance today. Your breathing sounds labored. Must be challenging poses." When David asked about my newfound flexibility and whether I'd finally mastered that pose that had been giving me trouble, I made jokes about warrior poses and downward dogs, hoping my voice didn't betray the panic rising in my throat. He started checking my stories more carefully, asking specific questions about book plots I should have discussed and pottery techniques I claimed to be learning. I scrambled to research answers, spending hours on YouTube learning about glazes and firing temperatures and character development for conversations that lasted mere minutes. The worst part was how good I became at lying. I'd always been terrible at deception, wearing my emotions like billboards. But desperation made me creative. I memorized yoga sequences I'd never attempted, created elaborate backstories for fictional classmates, researched pottery techniques with the dedication of someone pursuing a graduate degree. The photography excuse worked longer because it was partially real. Ryan had been teaching me, and my pictures were genuinely improving at an alarming rate. When David asked to see my work, I showed him landscapes and architecture shots, carefully cropping out any evidence of my instructor or the intimate moments we'd shared. But David wasn't stupid. He'd married me 8 years ago, partly because I was a terrible liar, transparent in ways that had once seemed charming. My poker face had never improved, despite years of pretending his criticisms didn't sting or that I enjoyed his colleagues' dinner parties where I felt like an unwelcome appendage. The paranoia started small. He'd mentioned running into people from my various classes who somehow never seemed to know me. He'd asked to see receipts from purchases I claimed to make for art supplies. He started paying attention to my schedule in ways that felt suffocating after months of freedom. One Tuesday, he followed me to yoga, sat in his car across from the community center, and watched as I walked past the entrance and kept going to the coffee shop where Ryan was waiting with my usual latte and a new lens he'd borrowed from a friend. He didn't confront me that night. Instead, he became methodical about gathering evidence, approaching my deception like a forensic accountant uncovering financial fraud. Started asking detailed questions about poses I should have learned, books I should have read, pottery pieces I claimed to be working on. I found myself living in a constant state of anxiety, always one question away from exposure. Every conversation felt like a minefield. I'd rehearse answers to potential questions, anticipating his logical follow-ups, trying to stay ahead of his suspicions. The stress was eating me alive. I'd lost weight, developed insomnia, started grinding my teeth so hard I cracked a molar. Ryan noticed but attributed it to the normal anxiety of someone exploring new interests. He had no idea I was maintaining an elaborate fiction to protect what we had. How do you explain to someone you love that you're living a double life that's slowly consuming you from the inside? 3 months after the library incident, David asked to see my pottery. "I don't have any finished pieces yet," I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. "Everything's still in the kiln. The instructor is very particular about timing and temperature control." He smiled that cold smile I'd learned to fear, the expression he wore when he'd found an error in someone else's logic. "Show me your photographs then. All of them. I'd love to see how much you've improved with all these classes you've been taking." My hands shook as I unlocked my phone. Most were innocent enough, but buried in the camera roll were pictures Ryan had taken of me. Candid shots where I was looking at him with unmistakable affection, my face soft and unguarded in ways David hadn't seen in years. Pictures of me laughing, concentrating on camera settings, caught in moments of pure joy that had been absent from our marriage for longer than I cared to admit. He scrolled through them methodically, his financial analyst brain cataloging evidence with the same precision he brought to budget spreadsheets. When he reached the photos from our weekend trip to the mountains, a trip I'd told him was a solo retreat to work on landscape photography and find myself in nature, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. There I was, arms wrapped around a man whose reflection he could see clearly in my sunglasses. Ryan's hands on my waist, both of us grinning like teenagers who'd just discovered they were in love. David set my phone down gently on the kitchen counter, like it might explode if handled roughly. "How long?" he asked. 4 months. I whispered, "And you're in love with him?" It wasn't a question. The certainty in his voice made my chest tight with something between relief and terror. I nodded anyway, unable to form words. David stood and walked to the window, hands in his pockets, staring out at the perfectly manicured yard he'd spent weekends maintaining according to homeowner association guidelines. For a long moment, we stood in silence, broken only by the hum of appliances and the distant sound of neighbors living their uncomplicated lives. "You know what's funny?" he finally said, his voice eerily calm. "I actually thought this was working. You seemed happier. More interesting. I was proud that I'd pushed you to grow." The words hung between us like a blade, sharp with unintended irony. I thought about defending myself, explaining how lonely I'd been during those 8 years. How his constant criticism had worn me down until I'd forgotten who I was outside of his disappointments. How Ryan had reminded me I could be someone worth loving, someone whose thoughts and dreams mattered enough to encourage rather than dismiss. Instead, I said, "I'm sorry." David laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. It was sharp and bitter, like coffee left too long on the burner. "You're not, though. Are you?" "Not really." He was right. I wasn't sorry for finding Ryan. I was sorry for lying, sorry for the deception, sorry it had come to this moment of reckoning in our sterile kitchen surrounded by appliances we'd chosen together. But I wasn't sorry for feeling alive again. I wasn't sorry for discovering I could be more than someone's disappointing wife. I expected him to explode, to throw things or demand I pack my bags immediately, to call me names or threaten to tell everyone what kind of person I really was. David's anger was usually cold and controlled, but I'd never seen him process betrayal before. Instead, David did something infinitely worse. He became practical. We spent the next 3 hours discussing our divorce like a business transaction, division of assets, timeline for separation. Who would tell his parents, my sister, our handful of mutual friends, whether I'd be moving in with my photographer? The clinical nature of it all made everything feel surreal, like we were planning someone else's life. 8 years of marriage reduced to logistics and paperwork. He even pulled out a legal pad and started making lists, his neat handwriting turning our life together into bullet points and action items. "I want the house," he said, writing it down with the same precision he used for grocery lists. "You can have the Honda. It's older, but reliable." I nodded. The house had always felt like his anyway, decorated according to his vision of sophisticated minimalism. Every surface carefully curated, every color chosen for its timeless appeal rather than emotional resonance. "You'll need to tell your mother," he continued, moving down his mental checklist. "I'll handle mine. They'll want to know before word spreads." The casual way he dismissed years of shared holidays and family dinners was devastating. His parents would probably be relieved. They'd never quite approved of their son marrying someone without a graduate degree or family money, someone who'd never quite mastered the art of cocktail party conversation. "What about counseling?" I asked desperately. "Maybe we could try to work through this." David looked at me with something approaching pity. "You're in love with someone else. What exactly would we work through?" He was right, but the finality of it was crushing. 8 years erased with an accountant's precision. "Do you hate me?" I asked. He considered the question seriously, which somehow made it worse. "No," he said finally, "but I don't understand you, and I don't think I ever did." That night, I called Ryan from my car in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, afraid to have the conversation in the house David and I still shared. The fluorescent lights from inside cast everything in harsh relief, making the whole scene feel like something from a movie about other people's lives. "Leave tonight," he said immediately when I finished explaining. "Pack a bag and come here. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." His certainty should have been comforting. Instead, it terrified me. Running away felt like something the old me would do, the woman who'd followed David across the country without question, who'd molded herself into whatever shape seemed most likely to earn approval. "I can't," I said. "Not tonight. I need to do this right." Ryan was quiet for a long moment. I could hear traffic in the background, the sounds of a life continuing normally while mine fell apart. "Are you having second thoughts?" he asked finally, and I could hear the carefully controlled fear in his voice. "No, but I can't just disappear. We built a life together, even if it wasn't the right one." I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. "Okay," he said, "but promise me you won't let him talk you out of this. You deserve to be happy." The words were simple, but they carried weight I was still learning to accept. For 8 years, happiness had seemed like a luxury I couldn't afford, something selfish to want when I had security and stability. After we hung up, I sat in my car for another hour, watching other people's lives through diner windows. Normal people having normal breakups, normal fights, normal reconciliations. Nothing about my situation felt normal, but maybe normal was overrated. When I finally went home, David was in his office, laptop open, already researching divorce lawyers with the same thoroughness he brought to major purchases. I stayed and helped plan my own exit. David threw himself into the arrangements with frightening efficiency. He found a lawyer, opened separate bank accounts, researched apartment complexes in my price range. He created spreadsheets for everything, color-coded and cross-referenced. Asset division in blue, timeline in green, contact information in red. It was as if he was managing a project at work, something that required his complete professional attention. Meanwhile, I felt like I was floating outside my own life, watching someone else methodically dismantle everything familiar. I'd catch myself staring at our wedding photos on the mantle, wondering when exactly we'd stopped looking at each other with genuine affection. Had there ever been a time when David looked at me the way Ryan did? Like I was fascinating instead of a problem to be solved? I started packing slowly, one box at a time. Most of our possessions felt foreign to me now. Decorative objects David had chosen for their investment potential. Books we'd never discussed. Kitchen gadgets for elaborate meals I'd never been allowed to experiment with because David had strong opinions about proper techniques and ingredient ratios. The strangest part was how civil we remained. We discussed custody of our ancient golden retriever, the same way we'd once planned vacation itineraries. Buster was 13 and arthritic, more likely to sleep through dramatic moments than cause them. David agreed I should take him, partly out of practicality, and partly, I suspected, because he'd never been particularly attached to pets. David even helped me research photography programs at the local community college, printing out course catalogs and highlighting classes he thought would suit my interests. "You should pursue it seriously," he said one evening over takeout Chinese food from containers that felt more like a peace treaty than dinner. "You have real talent." I should have encouraged it years ago. It was the kindest thing he'd said to me in months, maybe years. I almost started crying into my lo mein. "Why now?" I asked. Why are you being nice to me now? He set down his chopsticks and considered the question seriously, the same way he approached everything else. Because I can see who you really are for the first time, he said. And she's not someone I know how to love. The words hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't being cruel. He was being honest in a way that felt more painful than anger would have been. We were wrong for each other, he continued. I tried to turn you into someone you weren't, and you tried to be someone you couldn't be. We made each other miserable without realizing it. I wanted to argue, to defend our 8 years together. But looking back, I couldn't remember the last time we'd laughed together or had a conversation that didn't involve household management or social obligation. When had we stopped being curious about each other's thoughts? The divorce papers were filed within 2 weeks. David handled everything with the same efficiency he brought to tax preparation and home maintenance schedules. I signed where he indicated, feeling disconnected from my own signature, like I was watching someone else dissolve their life. My sister called the night before I moved out. Mom told me what happened, she said, her voice carefully neutral in the way that meant she'd been instructed not to take sides. I figured she would. Are you sure you're doing the right thing? I'm sure, I said, though my voice shook with everything I couldn't say. David's a good man. I know he is. We're just not good for each other, she sighed, and I could picture her in her own perfect kitchen, surrounded by her own perfect life. What about the photographer? Is this real or just a midlife crisis? I thought about Ryan's laugh, the way he listened when I talked about dreams I'd forgotten I had, how he made me feel like my thoughts mattered enough to explore rather than dismiss. It's real, I said. Well, she said after a pause that lasted too long. I hope you know what you're doing. After we hung up, I wondered if I did. Was I throwing away 8 years of stability for something that might burn out in 6 months? Was I destroying a secure life for the illusion of happiness? But then I remembered how it felt to be invisible in my own marriage, and the doubts faded. 2 weeks later, I moved in with Ryan. His apartment was beautiful chaos compared to David's minimalist aesthetic. Books stacked everywhere, not organized by subject or author, but by when he'd read them and which ones had changed his thinking. Camera equipment stored in creative solutions involving milk crates and repurposed furniture that somehow looked intentional rather than haphazard. Plants in various stages of thriving or dying depending on how often he remembered to water them, but each one chosen for beauty rather than low maintenance. Canvases leaned against walls, half-finished paintings that spoke to a creativity I'd forgotten was possible. The refrigerator was covered with photos he'd taken, postcards from places he'd traveled, newspaper clippings of articles that had made him think. It should have felt overwhelming after 8 years of pristine surfaces and coordinated color schemes. Instead, it felt like stepping into a life I'd forgotten I wanted. Ryan helped me unpack my few boxes, treating each item like treasure he was honored to help arrange. When I pulled out my neglected sketchbooks from college, filled with drawings I'd abandoned when David suggested I focus on more practical pursuits, he immediately claimed wall space in his hallway. This is who you are, he said, carefully hanging a charcoal portrait I'd done years ago of an elderly woman waiting for a bus, not just someone's wife. The words hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent so long being half of something that I'd forgotten how to be whole on my own. Living with Ryan was like learning a new language. He left love notes in my camera bag, brought me coffee in bed without being asked about my dreams both literal and metaphorical. He celebrated small victories, like when I finally mastered manual focus or sold my first photograph to a local gallery for $50. But the transition wasn't seamless. I'd catch myself apologizing for taking up space, asking permission to rearrange furniture or choose what to watch on television. 8 years of deferring to David's preferences had trained me to minimize my own needs, to present options rather than state preferences. Ryan noticed immediately. You don't have to ask to exist here, he said gently after I'd apologized for using too much hot water in the shower. This is your home too. Learning to trust that took months. The divorce finalized 6 months later. David kept the house, the furniture, most of our mutual friends who found my behavior incomprehensible. They'd known us as a couple, seen us at dinner parties and charity events, and couldn't reconcile the composed woman they remembered with someone capable of such deception. I kept my freedom and a small settlement that let me enroll in photography school full-time. The day the papers were official, I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot and cried for 20 minutes. Not from regret, but from relief so profound it felt physical, like setting down a weight I'd been carrying for years without realizing how heavy it had become. Ryan found me there, having tracked down the courthouse when I didn't come home at the expected time. How do you feel? He asked, sliding into the passenger seat. Free, I said. Terrified, but free. He took my hand, and I marveled at how different it felt to be comforted rather than managed. We'll figure out the terrified part together. Starting over at 32 felt like learning to walk again. I had to rebuild everything. My sense of identity, my social circle, my career aspirations. Photography school was humbling. I was older than most of my classmates, less technically skilled, but hungrier to learn. My instructor was a woman in her 50s who'd left a successful law career to pursue art after her own divorce. You have good instincts, she told me after reviewing my portfolio, but you're afraid to trust them. Stop asking for permission to be an artist. She was right. Years with David had trained me to second-guess every creative impulse, to seek approval before acting on any idea. I'd present concepts tentatively, ready to abandon them at the first sign of criticism. I started small. Street photography where I couldn't ask for permission. Candid shots that captured moments before they disappeared. Portraits of strangers who agreed to let me document their stories after brief conversations that revealed unexpected depth. Ryan encouraged everything. He'd come with me on photo walks, carrying equipment and offering technical advice when asked. But he never tried to direct my vision or suggest improvements unless I specifically requested feedback. The difference was intoxicating. For the first time in years, I was creating something that belonged entirely to me. 6 months after the divorce, my instructor suggested I apply for a showing at a local gallery. The theme was transitions, and she thought my work would fit perfectly. I spent weeks agonizing over which pieces to submit. Ryan helped me arrange them in different combinations, offering opinions but ultimately letting me make the final decision. The process felt like learning to trust my own judgment after years of deferring to someone else's taste. The day of the gallery opening, I was so nervous I could barely eat. What if no one came? What if my work wasn't good enough? What if David showed up and saw proof of how much happier I was without him? Ryan straightened my dress and kissed my forehead. Whatever happens tonight, you did this. You took your vision and made it real. That's not nothing. The opening exceeded my expectations. People actually showed up. Strangers who looked at my photographs with genuine interest. I sold 3 pieces and received commissions for 2 more. But the moment that mattered most was when an elderly woman approached me near the end of the evening. "These portraits," she said, gesturing to my series on divorced women rebuilding their lives. "They're brave." "Thank you," I managed. "I was married for 43 years, she continued. "Been divorced for 5. I wish I'd had the courage to start over when I was your age." She bought the centerpiece of the collection, a self-portrait I'd taken the day my divorce was final. In it, I'm crying, but there's something triumphant in my expression, like I'm greeting grief and relief at the same time. That night, Ryan and I celebrated at the same diner where I'd called him the night David discovered my affair. "I'm proud of you," he said over terrible coffee and surprisingly good pie. "For what?" "For becoming who you were always supposed to be." David remarried 2 years later to a colleague from his firm. I found out through mutual friends who felt obligated to keep me informed of his life developments, as if I might care about the details of his happiness. His new wife was everything I'd tried and failed to be: polished, professionally successful, comfortable in the social circles David valued. She had a law degree and came from the kind of family that summered in the Hamptons. Her Instagram showed their perfectly organized home, their couple's vacations to places David and I had never been able to afford, their coordinated workout routines and meal prep containers. She looked happy in that controlled, composed way I'd once tried to master. I wondered if he'd told her she was too clingy yet, if he'd started noticing the ways she fell short of his expectations. A year later, I received an unexpected message through my photography website. It was from David's new wife. "I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I wanted to ask you something. David mentioned you take portraits of women going through transitions. I'm thinking about making some changes in my life and wondered if you might have time to photograph me." I stared at the message for a long time. The woman who'd replaced me wanted me to document her own potential escape. The irony was almost too perfect to be real. I wrote back suggesting we meet for coffee first, to discuss what kind of session she had in mind. We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind of place I'd learned to love during my afternoon walks with Ryan. She was prettier than her photos, but there was something brittle about her composure. She ordered black coffee and sat with perfect posture, hands folded in her lap like she was at a business meeting. "I'm thinking about leaving him," she said without preamble. "David, I mean. I know you were married to him before, and I thought maybe you might understand what I'm going through." I studied her face, looking for signs of the desperation I remembered feeling during my own marriage. The careful makeup that couldn't quite hide the exhaustion around her eyes, the way she held herself like she might shatter if she relaxed. "What happened?" I asked gently. "Nothing dramatic," she said. "That's the problem. He's not cruel or abusive. He's just controlling. Everything has to be his way. I feel like I'm disappearing." The words were almost identical to what I might have said 3 years earlier. "How long have you been married?" 2 years. "But we've been together for 3. I did quick math in my head. They'd started dating before our divorce was even final. While I was still lying about book clubs and pottery classes, David had already found my replacement. "Have you tried counseling?" She laughed bitterly, a sound I recognized from my own throat during the worst months of my marriage. "He says I'm the one with problems, that I'm too independent and need to learn to compromise." Sound familiar? Painfully familiar. I agreed to photograph her, not because I wanted to help destroy David's second marriage, but because I recognized the look in her eyes. The same trapped desperation I'd carried for years before finding the courage to leave. We scheduled the session for the following week. I decided to photograph her in the same location where I'd taken my own post-divorce self-portrait, curious to see how different women processed similar experiences. The session was intense. She started composed, almost formal, presenting the image of successful professional competence she'd perfected for David's colleagues. But as we worked, her careful facade began to crack. The real woman underneath was angry, exhausted, trapped in a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt suffocating to live. By the end, she was crying, but like me and my self-portrait, there was something liberating about the tears. I never sent her those photos. They felt too private, too raw for anyone but her to see, but I kept them, adding them to a growing collection of women brave enough to document their moments of transformation. 2 months later, she sent me another message. She'd filed for divorce and wanted to book a follow-up session to document the aftermath. Ryan and I moved to Oregon 3 years after we met, drawn by job opportunities and the promise of better light for photography. The mountains there demanded to be captured, and I found myself drawn to landscape work in ways that surprised me, but my heart remained with portraiture. I opened a small studio specializing in women in transition, divorces, career changes, new mothers, cancer survivors, people in the process of reclaiming themselves from lives that had grown too small. The work was emotionally demanding, but deeply satisfying. Every woman who sat for me reminded me of my own journey. The courage it had taken to admit my marriage was killing who I was meant to be. One client was a 60-year-old woman leaving her husband after 35 years of marriage. "I wasted so much time," she said during our consultation, her voice heavy with regret. "You left when you were ready," I replied. That takes its own kind of strength. Another was a young mother who'd given up her medical career to stay home with children. I love my kids, she said, but I'm not sure I remember who I am without them. We worked together to create images that showed her in both roles, devoted mother and ambitious professional. The photos helped her see that she could be both without apology. The most challenging session was with a woman whose story mirrored my own too closely for comfort. She'd been having an affair, had been discovered, and was now navigating the aftermath of her own double life. Do you think I'm a terrible person? She asked during the shoot. I thought carefully before answering. I think you're a person who made difficult choices in an impossible situation. Whether those choices were right or wrong isn't for me to judge. The photos from that session were among my best work. They captured something raw and honest about the complexity of human relationships, the way love and guilt could coexist in the same moment. Ryan and I never married, though we talked about it occasionally. After my experience with David, the institution felt less important than the daily choice to stay together. We bought a house together, adopted 2 rescue dogs who filled our home with chaos and joy, built a life that felt sustainable rather than perfect. Our house was nothing like the minimalist perfection I'd shared with David. It was warm and lived in, walls covered with photographs and artwork from local artists, bookshelves overflowing with subjects that interested us rather than impressive titles chosen for display. We had friends who came for dinner parties that lasted until midnight, conversations that meandered through politics and art and dreams we were still pursuing. I learned to cook dishes David had deemed too messy or impractical, experimented with flavors and techniques without fear of criticism. On slow afternoons, we'd hike the trails where we'd first met during my visits back to our old city. Sometimes I thought about the woman I was then, so desperate to shrink herself to fit someone else's expectations. That woman seemed like a stranger now. 5 years after my divorce, I received an unexpected email. It was from David. I saw your exhibition announcement in the paper. Congratulations. You look happy in the photo. The message had taken him 3 weeks to send, according to the timestamp. I could imagine him writing and rewriting it, trying to find the right tone between courtesy and genuine sentiment. I stared at his words for a long time, remembering how his approval had once meant everything to me, how I'd shaped myself around his opinions, measuring my worth by his reactions. Now it felt like hearing from a distant acquaintance, someone I'd known in a different lifetime. Thank you, I replied after several days of consideration. I am happy. I hope you are too. He never responded, and I deleted his contact information afterward. That night, Ryan found me looking through old photos on my laptop, pictures from my marriage, back when I still smiled with my whole face instead of the careful, composed expression I'd perfected for David's colleagues and family gatherings. Do you miss it? He asked, settling beside me on the couch with 2 cups of tea. The security? The certainty? I considered the question seriously. David had offered structure, stability, a clear role to play in a life mapped out with precision. There had been comfort in knowing exactly what was expected of me, even when those expectations felt like a straitjacket. Sometimes, I admitted, but I'd rather be uncertain and alive than secure and invisible. Ryan kissed the top of my head, a gesture so casual and affectionate it still surprised me after all these years. Good thing you got clingy with the right person this time. I laughed and pulled him closer, marveling at how different it felt to be wanted instead of merely tolerated. Outside, the Oregon rain drummed against our windows like applause. My latest photographs hung on the walls around us, proof of the life I'd built from scratch. Tomorrow, I had 3 portrait sessions scheduled and a consultation with a woman considering leaving her 20-year marriage. Each story reminded me that there was no single right way to build a life, no perfect timing for difficult decisions. Some women left marriages in their 20s, others in their 60s. Some had affairs. Others simply grew apart from spouses who never really knew them. What mattered wasn't the method of escape, but the courage to recognize when a life had become too small. My work had expanded beyond individual portraits. I'd started leading workshops for women going through major life transitions, teaching them to see themselves as worthy subjects, stories worth documenting and preserving. The workshops met monthly in my studio, a converted warehouse space with enormous windows that let in the kind of light photographers dream about. We'd start with technical basics, but quickly move into deeper territory. How to capture emotion, how to see past surface appearances, how to document transformation in progress. One woman had been recently widowed after 40 years of marriage. Another was starting medical school at 52. A third was adopting a child as a single mother after years of failed fertility treatments. Each carried a story of reinvention, of refusing to accept that their first version of themselves had to be their only version. Watching them learn to see themselves through their own lenses instead of someone else's expectations reminded me daily of my own journey. 6 years after leaving David, I received a commission that would change everything. A women's magazine wanted me to photograph survivors of domestic abuse who'd rebuilt their lives. The editor had seen my transition series and thought my approach would bring dignity to stories often sensationalized by media. The project took 8 months and introduced me to women whose courage made my own struggles seem almost manageable by comparison. Each had faced situations far more dangerous than my emotionally stifling marriage, yet their paths to freedom followed similar patterns. The slow recognition that something was wrong, the gathering of courage to act, the terrifying leap into uncertainty. One woman had escaped with her 3 children and nothing else, building a successful catering business from her apartment kitchen. Another had gone back to school at 45 to become a nurse, despite having been told for years she was too stupid for anything but housework. Their stories reminded me that strength comes in many forms, and that leaving any situation that diminishes you is an act of revolution, regardless of how dramatic it appears to outsiders. The magazine feature won several awards and led to more assignments. I found myself traveling to document women's stories across different cultures and circumstances, but always returning to the same theme: what happens when someone decides they deserve better? Ryan supported every trip, every late night in the darkroom, every emotional crash after particularly difficult interviews. He understood that this work wasn't just my career but my calling, born from my own experience of resurrection. 7 years after my divorce, David's second wife reached out again. This time, she was on the other side of her own divorce, wanting documentation of her emergence into single life. The woman who sat for me was completely different from the brittle perfection I'd met years earlier. She looked tired but genuine, present in her own skin in ways she hadn't been when trapped in David's vision of appropriate behavior. He never changed, she told me during our session. Still believes women are projects to be improved rather than people to be loved. I nodded, remembering. Some people are so invested in being right that they can't see when they're making everyone around them miserable, I said. She laughed for the first time during our conversation. His third wife reached out to me last week, she said. Apparently, he mentioned your photography work again. I stopped adjusting my camera settings. There's a third wife? Married 6 months ago. She's 28. Something about this information sat uneasily with me. 3 wives, all following the same pattern. Initial happiness, gradual erosion, eventual escape. David wasn't evil, but he was trapped in cycles he seemed unable to recognize or break. That night, I told Ryan about the conversation. Do you think I should warn her? I asked. Wife number 3? Ryan considered this seriously, understanding the ethical complexity. Would you have listened if someone had tried to warn you? Probably not. I thought I could fix things, make the marriage work if I just tried harder. People have to find their own way out, he said. But maybe your work speaks to them when they're ready to listen. He was right. My photographs had reached women I'd never meet, giving them permission to see their own stories as worth telling. That felt more valuable than individual interventions. 10 years after leaving David, I published a book of portraits titled, After, Women Who Rewrote Their Stories. It featured 50 women photographed at moments of transition, accompanied by their own words about the journey from who they were expected to be to who they chose to become. The launch party was held at the same gallery where I'd first shown my work. Looking around at the crowd, clients who'd become friends, fellow artists, women who'd found courage in seeing their stories reflected in others, I felt overwhelmed by gratitude. Ryan found me in a quiet corner, slightly overwhelmed by the attention. How does it feel? He asked. Like the end of one story and the beginning of another. The book became a bestseller, not because it offered easy answers, but because it acknowledged how complicated freedom could be. Leaving wasn't just about walking out a door, but about rebuilding identity, finances, support systems, dreams that had been deferred or abandoned. David never contacted me about the book, though I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd bought a copy. I wondered if he recognized himself in the stories, if he understood his role in these narratives of escape. His third wife lasted 2 years. The fourth contacted me before their first anniversary. I started declining these requests, not out of anger toward David, but because I realized my role wasn't to document his effect on women, but to help them document their own strength. 15 years after my divorce, Ryan proposed. Not because we needed marriage, but because he wanted to celebrate what we'd built together. The ceremony was small, held in our garden with our rescue dogs as witnesses and our closest friends as celebrants. My vows were simple. I promised to keep choosing you, and to keep choosing myself. David had been wrong about what I needed. I didn't need my own life separate from love. I needed love that made space for my life to grow. The woman who'd been called too clingy was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned the difference between attachment and suffocation, between love and possession. Someone who'd finally found her own life and chosen to share it rather than surrender it. In my studio now hangs the first photograph Ryan ever took of me, back when I was still married to David but discovering who I might become. In it, I'm learning to see the world through a camera lens, concentration replacing the careful composure I'd perfected for someone else's approval. Looking at it reminds me daily that transformation isn't a destination, but an ongoing choice. The decision to keep becoming, rather than simply existing. The storm that night had been fierce but cleansing, the kind of weather that strips away everything unnecessary and leaves only what's strong enough to endure. Just like the life I'd built after learning to let myself be loved without disappearing in the process. Every woman who sits for me now sees that photograph and asks about its story. I tell them about the courage it takes to admit you've been living the wrong life, and the even greater courage it takes to build the right one. Some listen and nod politely before leaving to return to situations that diminish them. Others see something in the image that gives them permission to imagine different endings to their own stories. Those are the women who come back 6 months later, ready to document their own transformations. The cycle continues, each woman's courage inspiring the next, proof that it's never too late to answer the question, what would you do if you truly believed you deserved better?